Comrades, let us speak plainly. The suffering that gnaws at your lives, the exhaustion that chains your hands, the despair that haunts your homes, none of it is accidental. None of it is a failure of character, of will, or of luck. Your struggle is not random, it is systemic. It is the predictable, inevitable result of a social order built to concentrate wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of a few, while the many toil in silence, producing the very resources that enslave them. Look around you, and do not be deceived by the illusions of freedom and choice the ruling class propagates. Every labourer who sweats in the factory, every clerk who bends under the weight of endless administration, every farmer whose harvest is claimed by distant owners, all are caught in the same machinery. This machinery is capitalism, an economic and social system designed not for the flourishing of humanity but for the accumulation of capital. It thrives by alienating you from your labour, from the products of your toil, and ultimately from each other. You produce, yet you possess nothing. You create, yet you are dispossessed. You live, yet your life belongs not to you but to the imperatives of profit. Understand this, comrades. The exploitation you endure is neither personal nor isolated. It is not the result of some moral failing or individual injustice. It is systemic, encoded into the very institutions of society. Property, wages, markets, law, and even culture serve the same purpose: to sustain the dominance of the bourgeoisie, to normalize inequality, to naturalize oppression. Ideology is their sword, culture their shield, and they wield both to convince you that your suffering is your own fault, that your chains are voluntary, that the struggle is private when it is universal. But the truth that must awaken in your minds is revolutionary. Your oppression is collective, and so must be your liberation. No single act of rebellion, no isolated defiance can dismantle the architecture of exploitation. The factory, the office, the farm, the city streets, these are arenas of structural oppression, and only through collective consciousness can they be transformed. When the workers understand that the conditions they endure are not random misfortunes, but systematic tools of domination, the veil of false consciousness lifts. Awareness becomes the spark of organized struggle, and solidarity becomes the material force capable of tearing down the walls of tyranny. History has always been the history of class struggle. From the earliest feudal bonds to the modern wage system, the oppressed have been made to labour for the enrichment of others. The patterns are recognizable, the mechanisms clear, and the solution is no less obvious: unity, organization, and conscious action. The proletariat, the productive masses, must understand that they are not isolated victims, but the collective architects of potential liberation. Every injustice endured is a reminder of the structural necessity for resistance. Every moment of deprivation is a call to consciousness. Every act of solidarity, every strike, every shared grievance is the forging of revolutionary power. The bourgeoisie relies on your disunity, your resignation, your fear. They fear organized thought more than rebellious hands. They understand that the scattered energy of individual dissent can be managed, exploited, and contained. But the collective will of the conscious working class, that is terrifying. For when the oppressed act together, guided by analysis, strategy, and the recognition of systemic oppression, they become a force capable of overturning the entire order. The factories, the offices, the fields, the very institutions that enforce inequality, all can be repurposed to serve the many, not the few. Let no one deceive you. Reform alone will not liberate you. Charity, legislation, or moral appeals may offer temporary relief, but they do not dismantle the structural basis of your oppression. To truly transform society, the workers must organize not only for better wages or working conditions, but for the abolition of the system that produces inequality itself. Conscious, collective struggle is the key. Awareness without organization is impotent. Organization without awareness is blind. Together they become the engine of social revolution, the lever by which the world may be lifted from the hands of the few and placed firmly in the hands of the many. Comrades, recognize the patterns of your oppression, see the systemic forces that shape your lives, and refuse to accept your suffering as inevitable. The chains are not eternal, They are constructed, and they can be dismantled. But only through collective insight, through shared struggle, through relentless action guided by the principles of justice, equality, and human dignity, can the oppressed reclaim what has been stolen from them. Your struggle is not random, and it is not meaningless. It is systemic, and understanding this is the first step toward overthrowing the system itself. Comrades, it is imperative that we begin by confronting a truth so often obscured by the rhetoric of the ruling class. Your suffering is not random. It is not the consequence of personal weakness, poor decisions, or moral failure. Every ache in your body from long hours of labor, every worry over debts and scarcity, every anxiety over job security and survival, these are not mere accidents of life. They are deliberate, structural outcomes of a system that thrives on exploitation and inequality. Capitalism is not a neutral arena in which the strong succeed and the weak falter. It is a meticulously constructed apparatus designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few, while the majority toil under conditions that strip them of agency, dignity, and life itself. It is a system in which labor, the source of all wealth, is treated as a commodity to be bought, sold, and extracted, and in which human beings are reduced to tools for profit rather than recognized as creators of value and meaning. Consider the factory worker, the office clerk, the delivery driver, the nurse, the janitor, those whose labor is essential to the functioning of society, but whose compensation barely sustains life. They are not failing. The system is failing them, and intentionally so. The capitalist order requires that their labor be exploited, that their hours extend beyond the bounds of human endurance, and that their rewards remain minimal, while the fruits of their work are absorbed into the accumulation of capital for the few. This is not a flaw of implementation or an unfortunate side effect. It is a necessary feature of the economic system. Without the systematic oppression of the working class, without the extraction of surplus value, capitalism could not survive. The suffering you endure is encoded into the structures of production, embedded in wage hierarchies, enforced through job insecurity, and normalized through ideology that teaches you to accept scarcity and inequity as natural. The alienation imposed by capitalism extends far beyond the immediate extraction of labor. It separates you from the products of your work, the creative essence of what you produce, and even from your own sense of self. When you labor for a wage, the object of your effort, the chair, the machine, the report, the service, does not belong to you. It is taken, sold, and appropriated by others, leaving only the memory of effort and the faint compensation of a paycheck. Your work becomes a means to survive, rather than a fulfillment of human potential. It becomes a mechanism of survival rather than a manifestation of creativity, skill, and pride. This alienation is not a bug. It is the very mechanism that allows the ruling class to maintain dominance, to ensure that the majority remain tethered to the system that exploits them. Observe also how capitalism structures social relations to reinforce this. Oppression. Competition, hierarchy, and division are cultivated deliberately. Workers are pitted against one another, taught to see their peers as rivals rather than allies, to internalize scarcity as a personal failing rather than recognize it as systemic. The ideology of meritocracy masks the structural realities of inequality, convincing the oppressed that their suffering results from their own inadequacies rather than the machinations of an economic order designed to benefit the few. Culture, media, politics, and education all serve as instruments of this deception, naturalizing inequality, glorifying wealth, and portraying systemic oppression as individual responsibility. The realization that your suffering is systemic, not accidental, is a revolutionary awakening. It transforms the way you see your labor, your position in society, and your relationship with those around you. The hardships endured by one are the hardships endured by all. The exploitation faced by one group is the blueprint applied to the many. Understanding this is the first step toward consciousness, the recognition that your struggle is not isolated, that it is shared, and that its causes are collective rather than personal. Once this truth penetrates the mind, the seeds of solidarity are planted. Awareness of systemic oppression is the foundation of organized resistance, the basis upon which collective action is built, and the catalyst for revolutionary transformation. Comrades, your suffering is the product of deliberate structures of domination, enforced by economic institutions, legitimized by ideology, and perpetuated through social norms. It is woven into the very fabric of the society in which you live. It is present in the wage system that undervalues labor, in the markets that exploit scarcity, in the housing that confines you, in the healthcare that neglects you, and in the education that reproduces inequality. It is not random, it is not coincidental, and it is certainly not deserved. It is systematic, inevitable under the current order, and maintained through deliberate social, economic, and political mechanisms that favor the ruling class. Recognizing this truth is not despair, it is empowerment. To see the structure of oppression clearly is to understand the nature of the enemy, and to understand the enemy is to locate the path of resistance. Comrades, let us confront the reality that defines your existence under capitalism. You are alienated. This alienation is neither incidental nor abstract. It is concrete, tangible, and unavoidable within the structures of a system designed to exploit your labor. From the moment you enter the workplace, from the factory floor to the office cubicle, from the field to the workshop, your labor is torn from you. It is no longer an expression of your creativity, no longer an extension of your intellect, no longer a source of satisfaction or fulfillment. Instead, your work is transformed into a commodity, a mere instrument in the accumulation of profit for someone else. You pour your effort, skill, and time into producing value, yet the benefits of that labor are stolen, appropriated, and converted into wealth that you will never see, into power that you cannot touch, into influence that you cannot wield. This alienation is multi-layered and systematic. First, you are alienated from the act of labor itself. Your work is dictated, compartmentalized, and often stripped of autonomy. Every movement, every decision, every thought is regimented by procedures designed not to enhance your creativity, not to fulfill your human potential, but to maximize efficiency, output, and profit for the capitalist. You are forced to labor, not according to your own desires, not according to your own rhythm or imagination, but according to the imperatives of the market and the demands of those who own the means of production. In this way, labor ceases to be a humanizing activity and becomes an alien force, an external compulsion that dominates you rather than a voluntary engagement in creation. Second, you are alienated from the product of your labor. Everything you create, everything you fashion with skill, strength, and ingenuity, is taken from you the moment it leaves your hands. The chair you build, the software you program, the crops you cultivate, the service you provide, these are not yours to enjoy, to shape, or to claim. They are appropriated by the capitalist, transformed into commodities for sale, and converted into profit for someone who did not endure the toil, did not bear the risk, and did not invest the time and effort. The product of your labor becomes an instrument of your subjugation, a measure of your exploitation, a visible reminder that the world you create is not the world you inhabit or control. Third, you are alienated from each other. Capitalism thrives on division. It teaches you to compete, to envy, to distrust. Your fellow worker is portrayed as a rival for wages, for promotion, for scarce resources. Solidarity is discouraged, collective consciousness is undermined, and communal bonds are weakened so that the power of the masses remains fragmented and ineffective. While you might share the same hardships, while your struggles are interconnected, you are taught to perceive them as individual problems. The system insists that your suffering is personal, that your lack of success is your own fault, and that cooperation or rebellion against these structures is dangerous. Through this engineered isolation, the capitalist ensures that the very force capable of overthrowing oppression, the unity of the laboring class, remains dormant and impotent. The consequence of this triple alienation is profound. It erodes the human spirit, dulls the mind, and stifles the potential for genuine human development. You are reduced to a cog in a vast machine, producing not for yourself, not for your community, not for the satisfaction of creation, but for the accumulation of wealth in distant hands. Your time, energy, and intellect are siphoned into structures that do not serve your needs but reinforce the dominance of the few. You labor endlessly, yet remain deprived. You give life to products, yet remain disconnected from their benefits. You work alongside peers, yet remain isolated from solidarity and shared purpose. To recognize this is to understand the essential truth of capitalism. It is not neutral, it is not benign, and it is not inevitable. The alienation of the worker is not an unfortunate side effect of industrialization or market development. It is the very foundation of the system. Without this separation of labor from life, of product from producer, of individual from collective, the capitalist class could not sustain its domination. It is through this alienation that profits are extracted, hierarchies maintained, and power consolidated. The suffering is structural, the disconnection intentional, the exploitation systemic. But in this recognition also lies the seed of liberation, to see the alienation for what it is, to understand that your labor, your products, and your relationships have been distorted to serve someone else, is to begin the process of reclaiming power. Alienation is only possible because the productive masses allow the means of production, the tools of creation, and the bonds of solidarity to be controlled by a class that has no interest in your well-being. Awareness of this injustice is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy, toward uniting with your fellow workers, toward transforming labor from a tool of oppression into an instrument of collective empowerment, toward re-establishing a human connection to what you create and to one another. Comrades, if you are to understand the true path to liberation, you must recognize that no individual struggle, no isolated act of defiance, no single outburst of rebellion can dismantle the structures of exploitation that define your lives. The power of the oppressed does not lie in solitary resistance. It lies in the consciousness of the many, in the unity of the working class, and in the organized solidarity of those who share both suffering and the potential for transformation. Collective consciousness is not a vague idea, a sentimental notion, or a moral imperative. It is a material force. It is the awareness that your individual hardships are bound together by a shared systemic oppression, that the injustice you endure is mirrored in the lives of millions, and that together you possess the power to challenge and overthrow the mechanisms of domination. The realization that you are not alone, that your labor, your exploitation, your pain, and your aspirations are part of a broader social reality is the foundation upon which revolutionary power is built. Consider the dynamics of capitalist society. It thrives on isolation, on division, on the fragmentation of collective strength. Workers are taught to compete against each other, to see peers as rivals, to internalize scarcity as a personal failure rather than a structural condition. The system cultivates distrust, fear, and resignation, undermining the bonds that could unite the masses. Yet, history demonstrates again and again that when workers recognize their shared interests and organize together, they become a force no system can easily suppress. The labor strikes, the uprisings, the revolutions of the past were not born from random suffering alone. They were born from consciousness, the moment when individuals understood themselves as part of a collective and when solidarity transformed that understanding into organized action. Awareness without solidarity is impotent, just as solidarity without awareness is directionless. Only together do they constitute the material force of change. Collective consciousness begins with education, reflection, and dialogue among the oppressed. It is the recognition that your grievances are not personal failings but evidence of systemic oppression, and that your liberation is impossible without the liberation of your fellow workers. When you see that your struggles are interconnected, that the conditions imposed on one sector of labor are a blueprint applied to the many, that the exploitation of one group reinforces the oppression of all, you begin to think beyond survival and toward strategy, beyond anger and toward purpose. This awakening is not abstract or philosophical. It is practical, urgent, and profoundly revolutionary. It is the moment when despair is transformed into agency, when isolation becomes cooperation, when individual energy is concentrated into collective force. Solidarity, the tangible expression of this consciousness, is the mechanism through which revolutionary power is exercised. It is built in the factories, in the offices, in the fields, and in every place where labor is organized and exploited. It is forged through shared struggle, mutual support, and recognition of interdependence. When workers strike together, when they demand fair wages, humane conditions, and control over their labor, when they support one another against the threats of dismissal, repression, or coercion, they create a network of power that cannot be ignored. Solidarity turns the abstract idea of shared oppression into a concrete, unstoppable force. It transforms scattered grievances into coordinated action, isolated discontent into collective leverage, and individual courage into revolutionary potential. The capitalist system fears this awareness more than overt rebellion. A single act of defiance can be contained, neutralized, or absorbed into the machinery of profit, but the collective conscious organization of workers threatens the very foundations of domination. The factories, offices, and fields, once instruments of exploitation, can be repurposed when labor acts in unity. The wealth generated by collective effort, the knowledge accumulated through shared experience, and the networks of support built through solidarity become tools of transformation capable of dismantling the structures that have long constrained human potential. Revolutionary power is not a myth, it is an emergent property of collective consciousness, an inevitable force once workers recognize the shared nature of their struggle and act. Accordingly, comrades, do not underestimate the potency of unity guided by awareness. It is through the cultivation of collective consciousness and solidarity that the working class acquires the ability to challenge and overturn systemic oppression. Without it, individual efforts are diffused, fragmented, and ultimately defeated. With it, the very architecture of capitalist domination can be confronted and transformed. Understanding this truth, embracing it, and acting upon it is the responsibility of every oppressed person who seeks liberation, for the strength of the many, when conscious and united, becomes greater than any power wielded by the few. Comrades, listen closely. Do not be fooled by the soothing promises of reform. The ruling class will offer concessions, palliative measures, and minor adjustments to conditions, claiming these as progress, as evidence of justice, as proof that the system is capable of fairness. They may increase wages slightly, enact regulations that appear to protect workers, or introduce policies that appear to soften exploitation. But these reforms are illusory, superficial, and ultimately designed to stabilize the very structures that oppress you. They are instruments of control intended to pacify discontent, to give the appearance of responsiveness, and to channel the energies of the oppressed into dead ends that leave the fundamental mechanisms of domination intact. Reforms may ease suffering temporarily, but they cannot, and will not, dismantle the system that produces the suffering in the first place. Capitalism does not survive by accident, it survives because it is resilient, adaptive, and entrenched. Its power is rooted not only in economic control, but in the social, political, and ideological institutions that reproduce inequality. It relies on the labor of the many to generate profit for the few, and it legitimizes this exploitation through culture, law, and ideology. Any reform that does not challenge the structural basis of this exploitation is merely cosmetic. Increasing a wage marginally does not remove the alienation of labor. Regulating working hours does not return the products of labor to those who produce them. Establishing minimum standards does not abolish the hierarchy that places a few above the many. Reforms may be comforting, but they do not threaten the foundations of power. They are a means of survival for the system, not for the oppressed. True liberation is not granted by the benevolence of those who profit from your labor. It is not offered in parliamentary legislation, in charity, or in the rhetoric of moral concern. These measures can never create equality, justice, or freedom because they leave untouched the fundamental relationships of domination that structure society. The ruling class will give only as much as is necessary to prevent unrest, to manage dissent, and to maintain the flow of profit. They fear the moment when the working class recognizes its collective strength, organizes with discipline and intelligence, and acts in conscious coordination. That is the moment when the system is truly threatened, for no superficial adjustment can withstand the force of a mobilized and aware population acting in unison. Organized, conscious struggle is therefore the only path to genuine transformation. It requires that the oppressed move beyond isolated grievances and spontaneous outbursts of anger, and instead develop an understanding of the systemic nature of their exploitation. Awareness must be combined with strategy, knowledge must be paired with action, and solidarity must transform into discipline. Collective force. A strike, a protest, or a campaign is not merely a tactic. It is part of a larger process of challenging the structures that perpetuate inequality. When workers act together with clarity of purpose, they disrupt the production, distribution, and accumulation of wealth in a way that mere reforms cannot. They assert their power, reclaim agency over their labor, and challenge the legitimacy of a system that relies on passivity and division. History teaches us that systemic change never emerges from gradual concessions or from the goodwill of the powerful. It arises when the oppressed recognize that their liberation depends not on the benevolence of the ruling class, but on their own initiative, unity, and collective intelligence. Revolutions are born not from reform, but from the awakening of consciousness and the disciplined application of collective strength. When the masses understand the mechanisms of oppression, when they organize in their workplaces, communities, and institutions, when they align strategy with solidarity, they become an unstoppable force capable of overturning the very structures that have constrained them for generations. Comrades, reforms may soften the edges of suffering, but they do not remove the chains. They do not return control over labor to the workers, nor do they dismantle the hierarchies that define capitalism. Only through conscious, organized struggle can the oppressed reclaim the fruits of their labor, assert their dignity, and challenge the legitimacy of the existing order. Only through coordinated action, grounded in awareness of systemic exploitation, can the structures that produce inequality be confronted and transformed. The path to liberation is not in waiting for favors from those who profit from your toil. It is in the deliberate, disciplined, and collective assertion of your own power. Comrades, the first step toward any meaningful liberation is understanding the system that oppresses you. To act without knowledge, to rebel without awareness, is to strike blindly and risk exhaustion without effect. The chains that bind you are not invisible. They are the product of human design, enforced through laws, institutions, economic structures, and social ideologies that serve the interests of the few while subjugating the many. Systemic oppression is not a collection of random injustices. It is a coherent and deliberate framework, a network of interlocking mechanisms that ensures power remains concentrated and inequality persists. To understand this system is to recognize the causes of your suffering, to see the connections between personal hardship and societal design, and to illuminate the pathways by which you may reclaim control over your labor, your life, and your society. This oppression manifests in countless ways, both obvious and subtle. The worker who labors long hours for minimal pay experiences the system in one form. The student burdened with debt experiences it in another. The marginalized community denied access to health care, housing, or education experiences it differently, but no less painfully. These are not isolated misfortunes, nor are they consequences of individual failure. They are deliberate consequences of a system that measures human value in profit, efficiency, and utility to the ruling class. Recognizing these patterns, seeing how wealth, privilege, and opportunity are distributed not by fairness, but by the preservation of power, is the foundation of revolutionary awareness. Knowledge of oppression is the spark that awakens consciousness, the lens that reveals the social and economic machinery that must be challenged. Understanding systemic oppression also reveals the relationships between different forms of exploitation. The workers' struggle is linked to the peasants, the teachers, the nurses, the caregivers. Poverty is not merely economic, it is political, cultural, and social. Discrimination, marginalization, and alienation are not accidental, they are structural. Every law, every policy, every cultural norm has been shaped to maintain the hierarchy, to sustain the privileges of the few, and to limit the autonomy of the many. When the oppressed grasp these connections, when they see that their individual suffering is mirrored in the struggles of others, and that these struggles stem from shared structures of domination, they begin to think collectively rather than individually. They see that their liberation cannot be achieved in isolation, and that only through understanding the system as a whole can they begin to envision the paths of resistance. Once oppression is understood as systemic, it becomes clear that reclaiming control requires conscious, organized action. Awareness without action is impotent. Knowledge alone cannot alter the structures of power, but awareness is the necessary precursor to effective struggle because it informs strategy, guides solidarity, and shapes the methods of resistance. It allows the oppressed to identify the levers of power, to understand where their collective force can be most effective, and to organize efforts that challenge not merely symptoms of exploitation, but the roots of domination itself. Systemic understanding transforms despair into agency and chaos into purpose. For those who comprehend the architecture of oppression can act with precision and coordination. Furthermore, understanding systemic oppression exposes the illusions that perpetuate subjugation. Ideologies of meritocracy, individualism, and neutrality are revealed as tools of control constructed to convince the oppressed that their position is natural, deserved, or immutable. Culture, education, and media reinforce these myths, shaping perceptions to obscure reality. When these illusions are stripped away, the oppressed see the world as it truly is, a world divided by power, controlled by structures designed to maintain inequality, and sustained by human labor extracted without equitable return. This revelation is empowering because it removes guilt, shame, and self-blame, replacing them with clarity, insight, and a roadmap for organized struggle. Finally, the comprehension of systemic oppression allows the oppressed to envision transformation. Once the mechanisms of exploitation are revealed, alternatives can be imagined and pursued. The laboring masses can reclaim the control that has been denied to them over production, resources, and social institutions. They can unite with others who share their struggles, develop strategies for collective action, and build structures of solidarity that reflect the interests of the many rather than the few. Understanding oppression is not passive. It is the foundation for deliberate, coordinated, and revolutionary effort. It is the first step toward turning awareness into power, knowledge into action, and suffering into organized, transformative force. Comrades, we have traced the reality of your suffering, uncovered the mechanisms of exploitation, and revealed the structural chains that bind your labor, your creativity, and your lives. We have seen that your struggle is not random, that alienation is deliberate, and that the power to change lies not in waiting for mercy, but in organizing, understanding, and acting together. The path forward is clear. Collective consciousness, solidarity, and disciplined, conscious struggle are the forces through which liberation becomes possible. Reforms may soothe, concessions may distract, but they cannot overturn the system. Only you, the productive masses, united in awareness of oppression and committed to coordinated action, can seize control of your labor, reclaim the fruits of your effort, and transform society into one that serves humanity rather than profit. Awaken to this truth, recognize your shared power, and act with intelligence, courage, and unwavering determination. Your chains are man-made, your suffering is systemic, but so too is the capacity to dismantle the structures that impose it. The moment for realization has arrived, and the moment for action cannot be delayed. History belongs not to those who maintain oppression, but to those who rise with understanding and solidarity to reclaim what has been stolen. The system is not eternal, and the world can be remade through collective effort. Comrades, rise, organize, and act. For it is only through your conscious, united struggle that the world can be transformed, the oppressed liberated, and justice made real.